Welcome. In this segment, we are joined by Dr. Shanna Katari, who's a faculty member in the School of Social Work and a social justice policy advocate. And I'm really very thrilled to have Shanna joining us today to talk about social welfare policy, particularly facing transgender and non-binary communities. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Katie. And I do want to mention that I use she and her pronouns. I think it's important when we talk about people, we use language that's really responsive to how they identify. So if you're watching this and you're like, I want to talk about how awesome she was, you can use the term she. So hopefully that's helpful in framing that a little bit.
Thank you. So I first want to start by just helping those who are watching have a little bit of context for thinking about transgender and non-binary populations and some of the policy issues facing this community. So I'm wondering if you could kind of help define the community and provide a little bit of context as we get started.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really interesting community to define because every individual has a different label that fits for them. We often think about issues of transgender communities being a really new issue, but we know throughout history, various cultures had people that identified outside of this two-gender binary man-woman structure. So it's actually not a completely new idea at all. In the U.S., if we go back to indigenous communities, many of them had a third or fourth or even just multiple gender identities, which sometimes falls under the term two-spirits nowadays, although that also sometimes covers sexual orientation. Internationally, lots of different cultures have had multiple gender identities. And so the term transgender really is this giant umbrella that covers anyone whose identity does not fall in this kind of prescribed box of being cisgender. So I'm cisgender. My gender identity is in a line with social expectations of the sex I was assigned at birth. So I was assigned female, I identify as a woman. It all matches up very nicely in the way society would expect for me. But there's lots of people for whom that's not the case. Now, some of these people are just like, I was assigned female, I'm a woman, but I like to dress in a more masculine way or in a more gender neutral or genderless way, and they may or may not identify as transgender. And then there's folks who are, for example, assigned female at birth, like I was, but identify as a man or identify as masculine as their internal sense of self. And so the transgender umbrella kind of covers that whole group. And more recently, there's been a lot more conversation about the idea of being non-binary. And again, there's a lot of different identities that fall under there: agender, genderqueer, genderless, NB, which is ENBY, which is short for non-binary. And those folks, again, have all of these different genders, but that play outside of that context. So rather than saying, I was assigned one thing, like male, and identify as the other, as a woman, it's saying, you know what, it doesn't matter what I was assigned. I just identify as who I am. And some days I want to wear masculine clothing, and some days I want to wear feminine clothing, or perhaps I don't want to wear masculine or feminine clothing, and I just want to wear very middle-of-the-road neutral, or I reject the idea that there's a binary, right? And so all of those different identities fall under this trans and non-binary umbrella. And different countries have different language for it, even within the U.S. Often you'll see regional differences around language, age-based differences, sometimes across racial and other identities. But I'm going to use the term trans and non-binary for the purpose of this conversation as anyone whose gender does not fit in this assumptive box, and the term cisgender for folks who are like me, where things lined up nicely based on social expectations.
Great, thank you for laying that context. So I can imagine, so our discussion today, and this MOOC is about policy and the implications of social welfare policy and social policies as they affect different kinds of communities. So I can imagine that there are many policies and issues that are affecting the transgender and non-binary community. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could kind of help us to shed some light on some of those, and then I know we're going to talk about a few more in depth.
Yeah, so with the trans and non-binary community, there are issues that vary country to country, within a country, within provinces or states, and even within states, like in the U.S., between county to county, city to city. So there's lots of pieces that are at play. So some countries do not recognize being transgender as an identity at all, and in some countries it's actually illegal to be transgender. Versus at the other end of the spectrum, there are some countries that are so affirming and uplifting and have moved away from a two-gender at birth sex assignment system and give the option for a third gender, give an option to come back and change it much more easily, and cover surgeries or medical interventions if you have them, have non-discrimination policies. But the majority of the countries in the world fall somewhere in between. I personally am much more well-versed in U.S.-based policy, as that's where I've worked primarily. But again, it's really state-specific. So from a U.S. standpoint, we do not have an inclusive non-discrimination policy for employment, for housing, for public accommodations, any of those things that includes transgender people. So it comes down to a state-by-state basis. And some states will have, for example, employment non-discrimination where you cannot be fired for being trans, but you could be denied housing for being trans. Some states make it safe for housing and employment, but they don't have a public accommodations law. Something we've talked about a lot recently on the news is bathroom bills. People have, honestly, for many trans people, bathrooms should be the least of their worries. They have all of these other pieces, but the idea of regulating where someone can and cannot pee is this huge thing that's happening. So many people are familiar with North Carolina's bill, which would have required people to go into the bathroom based on the sex assigned at birth on their birth certificate. So if you think about being, the stereotypical idea of the pushback on that was like, oh, I'm a man, I have a beard, do you really want me in the women's room? Which is certainly a challenge. And it's also a huge problem for folks who are non-binary or who are kind of experimenting with their gender, and they're like, well, there's two bathrooms, neither one fits me. And now you're telling me I have to go into one that might not fit me at all. Bathrooms can be very unsafe. Trans women have to decide between getting beat up by going into the men's room or having the police called on them by going into the women's room. So bathrooms are a big piece of contention. Of course, employment and housing, insurance policy. So different insurances on a state-by-state basis will or won't cover certain trans-related care, and trans-related care can be what we think of as surgery and hormones and facial feminization and those type of things. But in some states, basically, once you say you're trans, then really anything outside of cough and cold treatment could be considered trans-related care. So it goes across the board. We've had issues in the past with registering for FAFSA, for financial aid, because it used to be that if you were assigned male, you had to register for selective service. But if you were a woman, a trans woman, you couldn't register for selective service because you weren't allowed to be trans in the military. But if you didn't register for selective service, you couldn't get financial aid. So the ways in which trans-related issues pop up in policy happen in so many ways and shapes and forms. Again, similarly with insurance, prior to ACA, if you had an M on your insurance card, you could get a prostate exam, but not a pap smear. And if you have an F, you could get a pap smear, but not a prostate exam. So what happens if you're a trans man, you have an M, but you still have a uterus and a cervix, right? Or you're a trans woman who needs a prostate exam, you don't need a pap smear, but you need these basic cancer preventing and cancer detecting mechanisms, but you couldn't because your insurance wouldn't cover it. So it really pops up in a lot of different ways. I think people know a lot about the bathroom policy and maybe a little bit about general discrimination in housing, employment, and public access. But I think we sometimes forget, things like safety in schools, healthcare. I mean, it really cuts across every type of policy.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. Thank you for kind of raising and talking about all these different issues, and it's interesting because in some ways it goes back to, and I know this is something that that you wanted to talk more about, to kind of this distinction on birth certificates, and the fact that for the majority of people in the U.S. there's a male box or a female box, and the implications that then has for all these other kinds of policies that are coming down. And so so I know that that's an area that you've spent a lot of time working on, is challenging that, raising awareness about the implications of it, and working to advocate for people who are trying to make changes to those that really very set kind of binary system that we have.
Yeah, documentation is crucial. If you think about, in your day-to-day, well, what do you use that might ask if you're male or female, right? And people think about, my driver's license. Okay, so that's one thing you'd have to change. But also things like your insurance card, both health insurance and car insurance, because we actually change auto rates based on the sex that's on your insurance, right? So we know that young males have higher auto insurance rates. But even things like your BuzzFeed quiz asks if you're male or female, right? We really create this binary. And while BuzzFeed might not be asking for your birth certificate, it's this idea that you should know this. It should be one of these two options. It should be exactly what it was at birth. And that changing any of that is a huge burden on members of the trans and non-binary community. So when we talk about changing, it's really sex, right? So sex is male and female, and gender is a much more expansive idea. And then there's also intersex folks, but the box option is male and female. But when we talk about changing sex boxes, or what some areas call the gender marker box, it is incredibly convoluted. It depends where you were born, where you live now, what type of transition you may want to have, what type of transition you are able to have. So it's completely state by state as far as changing your birth certificate. So some states you can go in and you can say this is inaccurate for me, sign an affidavit. I think California, and there's one other state that's currently doing this, and get an accurate change on your birth certificate. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, there's actually 3 states in this country where, regardless of how many surgeries, medical transitions, doctor's notes, judge's orders, you cannot in any way, shape, or form change your birth certificate. So if you are unlucky enough to be born in one of these states, you will never have an updated and correct birth certificate. And then, again, there's all these places in between. And some states say that you have to have some type of reproductive surgery. Now, if you're someone who's like, for example, I'm a trans guy and I don't want to have a hysterectomy, I'm really happy with my body and how it's working for me, the fact that you would have to choose to have an unnecessary, unmedically needed surgery in order to get accurate forms is ludicrous. It's not only expensive, but it's medically dangerous. Similarly, if you're someone who's non-binary, you don't even have an option of what to change it to unless you live in, I believe, the states on the West Coast have started to add more gender options where you can have an X instead of a male or a female. And your birth certificate can then be needed for all sorts of things, like if you don't have a driver's license yet, some insurances might require it for something, potentially adoption paperwork. You may or may not need your birth certificate. And then in some of the states, even if you can change your birth certificate, some states will print out a nice new birth certificate for you, and it has your name and it has your correct marker. But some states will actually stamp amended on your birth certificate, cross out the old information and put on the new. So that even if you have the new birth certificate, you've jumped through all the hoops, you've seen the doctor, you've had the intervention, you've done all of this, you still now have a birth certificate that outs you as trans in any setting. So there's the piece about that. There's the piece about name changes, right? Which also, again, varies state to state, sometimes county to county, but in most places, if you are someone who's getting married, you sign a marriage license, you put your new name on there. My partner and I actually combined our last names. We just put it on the license. Mazel tov, you're done. That's your new name. You take your license to Social Security and off you go. If you're a trans person, there's an incredible amount of hoops you have to jump through. In most states, not all, but most states, you have to start by getting an FBI fingerprint check, which costs money and takes several months to get, by getting a state Bureau of Investigation check, which also costs money and lesser months to get. So you have to balance when you send each out because they're only good for 60 days. And so you have to wait till they both come in. I'm originally from Colorado, so I know that system better. Then you have to go in front of a judge with all of this information and file, right? And so you have to hope that you have, at the very least, a trans neutral, if not trans affirming judge. And depending on, again, the county, you might have to stand in a room full of other people who are there for other reasons and say, this is why I'm choosing to change my name, share that you're trans, and hope that the judge is okay with it, because the judge can always shut down a name change. Then, if the judge is like, excellent, I'm on board, you get your name changed, you get a little piece of paper that you then have to take to a newspaper office. And you have to publish publicly that you're getting your name changed. 3 days in Colorado in a row. So it can either be the expensive newspaper, which is 3 days back to back, or a cheaper newspaper, but then it takes 3 weeks because they only publish 3 sections. And now with the internet, this is infinitely Googleable. So even though you've changed your new name, the fact that your old name or dead name is now on the internet for everybody to see when they're looking for you is there. Then you go back with proof from the newspaper, back to the judge's office, show them all of this information, then they stamp this for you, you pay extra money for all of the certified copies, and then and only then can you start going to Social Security, driver's license, all of this. So if you think about the cost of all of those pieces, it's hundreds of dollars, it's hours off of work. If you live in a county that doesn't have a supportive judge, you're out of luck because you can't, go to another county to change your name. If you go to the driver's license office, they might ask you why. I mean, it's just a really big undertaking. And we often, at least as cis people, don't think about the amount of effort that's required in that. And so thinking about, as far as policy, what does it look like to have a better birth certificate change? What does it look like to have a better name change policy? So that at the very least it's in line with cisgender people who are changing their names by getting married, where you can sign a piece of paper and then start the driver's license process, rather than going through all of these hoops that really are inaccessible for a lot of people.
Right, and very costly.
Absolutely. Or if you need childcare because you can't bring your kid into the courtroom, it's a really big undertaking. And a lot of places won't change your name on a work ID, on a school ID, on any of these things until you have a legal name change. So it's a pretty big choice to make. Some people are like, oh, well, it's just a name change. Don't worry about it. But if the choice is like having your real name or your fake name be, your old name, dead name be used at work, I mean, that's huge. And it's huge on people's mental health.
For sure.
It's huge on their health outcomes, awareness around their bodies, their self-confidence, all of that. Being called by the correct name, just like I talked about being called by correct pronouns, I mean, that's really a life-changing thing for people.
Yeah. Well, and I also think you raised a number of issues. I mean, things that we've been talking a lot about or have come up in other discussions within this book about the complexity of issues, the ripple effect of how kind of one policy has kind of, you can see these kind of dramatic effects in other areas. The issue of cost and how access to resources dramatically affects, kind of your outcomes in different arenas. But also the relationship between kind of a federal policy or a federal approach and a state approach. And so I'm also imagining, and you talked a little bit about how even at the county level it can be different. But so you go through all these hoops in the state of Colorado, and then you move to Nebraska, or you move to another state next door or far away. I assume you would have to potentially do everything again?
So the name change stuff should stay the same because it's a legal name change, and if you've done it through Social Security, etc. But the issue becomes with things that are tenuous like housing and employment. Trans people might be moving more often in order to find resources like safe housing for them. And so what happens if you start the process in Colorado and then you move to Michigan and you have the Colorado Bureau of Investigation fingerprints, but you don't have the Michigan ones? And so it's not necessarily that you'd have to change every time you move states. But if you're anywhere in the middle of the process, or you change insurance companies, or for example, Colorado, as well as about 10 other states, have really inclusive trans insurance, where their insurance policy, the Department of Insurance issued a bulletin that said, if you are an insurance based in Colorado, you have to cover trans medical expenses. Right? But that's not the case for every state. So let's say you're in Colorado, you've been on hormones for 20 years, they're covered for you every month, you pay your copay, but just like everything else. And then you move to, say, Kentucky. Suddenly, what you were budgeting for your monthly costs in Colorado have skyrocketed because now you're paying for your hormones out of pocket. And the choice becomes, do you put the money towards getting these hormones that you need that are required for care, right, but are not deemed medically necessary by the state because they're trans-related? Or do you stop taking it, but then potentially depression, anxiety, suicidality, because your body is no longer what it's been for the past 20, 30, even 5 years, right? You're changing back. You're moving out of that, not because you're choosing to, but if the choice is between hormones and food, right? Or hormones and rent. That's a big choice that no one should have to make. So things that vary like that state to state, or even choosing where you go. If you are someone who's trans or lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, etc., because there's no overarching policy in the federal government, you could go from a state where everything is open and affirming, and not only, you can get legally married now, anybody, right, regardless of gender, but if you move to a state where there's not a non-discrimination policy, you can be fired for having been out as trans in your previous job, or having been out as gay, or putting a picture of you at Pride with a trans flag. So is it technically legal to be trans? Yes. But how do you manage moving from like California to Florida, in a way that is, you can't take back the internet. So do you be your authentic self and hope that you will always live somewhere that recognizes that? Or do you really curate and manage your image and not show up for your community in the way that you want to, in case you might live somewhere where you need to be back in the closet? And then there's folks that can't be in the closet, right? For whatever reason, if you're non-binary, it's really hard to, make the decision to completely pretend that that's not who you are. Or do you spend every moment of every day educating people that they is in fact a valid pronoun, and that I should have just as many rights as anyone else?
Yeah, raising so many important issues and so many challenges that I think are not always that people don't always know about if you're not facing them. So I think it's really important that we're having this conversation. So I want to shift a little bit from challenges to thinking about solutions. So I know this is also, as a social justice policy advocate, this is where you spend a lot of your time, is both raising awareness and identifying challenges, but then also starting to think through some solutions. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us some of your thoughts about potential solutions, potential policy solutions that you've been advocating for.
Yeah, absolutely. So several states have moved to, or are trying to move towards, the idea of, to get a birth certificate changed, perhaps you still need to be identifying as trans, but that you don't need to have a medical intervention, and that you should be able to consider therapy just as valid as having hormones or some type of surgery. And so the idea that a social worker or someone who works in social welfare, a therapist, a counselor, should be able to sign the same documentation as a doctor that says you've had care related to gender transition and this is the correct marker that should be on your birth certificate. In Colorado, several organizations and individuals have been working very hard to try and get that passed, as well as the idea that it should be a new birth certificate, not an amended one. And it's died on party lines on a regular basis. But I think that that's somewhere where social workers, social welfare individuals can really be active, is especially if you're a cisgender person. If this is not a direct impact to you, so that you are not having to take the emotional labor of sharing your story, of being tokenized, is to be that person that goes to the hearings, that sends a letter to their representative, that tweets about it on Twitter. I think social media does have power. We know that stories change hearts and minds. And to learn what are the laws in your state? How can someone change their birth certificate? Can they even change it? And if not, this is a great thing to kind of start poking around and say, have people run bills like this in the past? If they failed, why? What would it take? Ask people that are running for office. Is this something that you would consider putting forward? If there's someone who hasn't put forward all their bills yet for the session, sending a letter and saying, I'm really passionate about that. If you are someone that works with this community, going to testify and saying, I know the impact that having an accurate birth certificate would bring to the clients that I work with, that the people that I engage with, talking about why there shouldn't have to be a medical intervention. And this is where I think that social justice piece comes in, is we talk about cost. We talk about self-determination. Someone can be trans and not want any medical intervention, so that should not prevent them from getting an accurate birth certificate. Similarly with name policies and name changes, everything from working to change the policy itself, but also it can be really complicated in certain states. And so different law schools, social work programs, and other kind of ventures, community organizations in states have set up name change clinics that will help people with all the paperwork to go through the process, creating a handout of these are the steps you need to take. These are the most friendly judges in the neighborhood. See if you can get on their docket. Somebody who will go sit in the courtroom with them so that they're not alone. To things like fundraising for the cost of name change so that people who might not be able to afford it otherwise are able to access it. But then even advocating in your own neighborhood about policies that require a legal name change or a legal gender marker change, and ask why.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you all for watching. You provided invaluable resources and tips and ideas for practical action that we all can take to be working on these issues moving forward.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching.